In the vast expanse of the Soviet-Afghan War, a conflict that would claim the lives of over 14,000 Soviet soldiers and leave an estimated 1 million Afghan civilians dead or wounded, there existed a multitude of battles that, though pivotal, have faded into the annals of history. One such battle, the siege for Hill 32-34, stands as a testament to the unyielding resolve of the Soviet 345th Independent Guards Airborne Regiment and the unrelenting ferocity of the Mujahideen forces. It was the year 1988, and the Soviet Union's grip on Afghanistan was beginning to slip. The international community had grown weary of the conflict, and the Soviet government was facing mounting pressure to withdraw its troops. In a last-ditch effort to secure key territories and maintain a semblance of control, the Soviet High Command devised Operation Magistral, a large-scale assault aimed at driving the Mujahideen from the strategic Salang Pass. At the heart of this operation lay Hill 32-34, a rugged, imposing outpost that offered an unparalleled vantage point over the surrounding terrain. Whoever controlled this hill would, in effect, control the pass. As the Soviet forces prepared to launch their assault, the Mujahideen, bolstered by a steady supply of American-made Stinger missiles, readied themselves for a fight that would shake the very foundations of the Soviet war effort. The stage was set for a clash of titans, one that would ultimately decide the fate of the Salang Pass and the future of Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. As the Soviet troops began their ascent up the unforgiving slopes of Hill 32-34, the weight of their mission hung precariously in the balance. Each soldier knew that the success of Operation Magistral rested squarely on their shoulders, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. As the Soviet troops trudged through the knee-deep snow, their footsteps echoed through the desolate landscape like a death knell, foreshadowing the impending carnage that would soon engulf Hill 32-34. The biting wind howled through the barren terrain, threatening to rip the very breath from their lungs, as they struggled to ascend the unforgiving slopes. Each soldier knew that the fate of Operation Magistral hung precariously in the balance, and the weight of their mission bore down upon them like an unyielding physical force. The consequences of failure loomed large, casting long, ominous shadows across the snow-covered terrain. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and the Soviet troops began to feel the effects of altitude sickness, their movements slowing as the oxygen-starved air sapped their strength. The Mujahideen, meanwhile, watched and waited, their eyes fixed intently on the Soviet forces as they struggled to gain a foothold on the hill. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional burst of gunfire or the mournful cry of a wounded soldier. The Soviet troops knew that they were running out of time, that the Mujahideen would not hesitate to launch a counterattack as soon as they had regrouped and repositioned. The clock was ticking, and the Soviet forces were acutely aware that every passing minute brought them closer to disaster. The soldiers' faces were etched with exhaustion, their eyes sunken, and their skin sallow, as they struggled to come to terms with the enormity of their task. They knew that the battle for Hill 32-34 would be a fight to the death, a clash of titans that would leave only one side standing. The question on every soldier's mind was simple: would they emerge victorious, or would they succumb to the unforgiving fury of the Mujahideen? As the Soviet troops inched their way up the treacherous slope, they suddenly found themselves face to face with a withering wall of fire, the Mujahideen having carefully positioned themselves to maximize the killing potential of their ambush. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the acrid stench of cordite hanging heavy over the battlefield like a malevolent specter, as the Soviet soldiers stumbled and fell, their bodies torn asunder by the hail of bullets that ripped through their ranks with deadly precision. The once orderly column was quickly reduced to a scene of utter chaos, the Soviet troops desperately seeking cover behind whatever meager protection the rocky terrain could offer, as the Mujahideen continued to pour fire into their positions, seemingly intent on annihilating the Soviet force. Yet, in the midst of this maelstrom of steel and fire, a glimmer of hope emerged, a turning point in the battle that would prove to be the linchpin upon which the outcome of the conflict would ultimately hinge. It began with a handful of Soviet soldiers, who, driven by a fierce determination to survive, began to fight back with a ferocity that bordered on the desperate, their bullets ripping into the Mujahideen positions with a newfound sense of purpose, slowly but surely beginning to drive the enemy back. The momentum of the battle was shifting, ever so slightly, in favor of the Soviet forces, as they clung tenaciously to the hill, refusing to yield in the face of overwhelming odds. The Mujahideen, however, were far from defeated, and the battle was about to enter its most intense phase yet. As the Soviet troops continued to claw their way back into the fight, the Mujahideen, sensing their grip on the hill beginning to slip, launched a frenzied counterattack, a desperate bid to shatter the Soviet lines and reclaim the initiative. The air was heavy with the acrid smell of smoke and sweat, the sound of gunfire and screams piercing the air as the two sides clashed in a maelstrom of violence. The Soviet soldiers, their bodies battered and bruised, their ammunition dwindling, steeled themselves for the onslaught, knowing that to yield now would be to invite annihilation. And yet, even as the Mujahideen hurled themselves forward with reckless abandon, the Soviet troops held firm, their training and discipline proving a bulwark against the tide of enemy fighters. The battle raged on, the outcome hanging precariously in the balance, as the Soviet troops, their senses dulled by the constant barrage of noise and chaos, fought on, driven by a primal urge to survive, to hold the hill, no matter the cost. The clock was ticking, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting the battlefield in a golden glow, as if mocking the carnage that had unfolded. The Mujahideen, their numbers seemingly endless, continued to press the attack, but the Soviet troops, their resolve unbroken, refused to yield, their determination to hold Hill 32-34 burning brighter with every passing moment. In this cauldron of fire and steel, the fate of the Soviet force hung in the balance, as the battle entered its most critical phase yet. The Soviets were running low on ammunition, their wounded crying out for aid, as the enemy closed in for the kill. As the last remnants of daylight faded, the Soviet troops steeled themselves for a final, desperate stand, their dwindling ammunition a stark reminder that time was running out. In a bold, last-ditch effort to break the siege, a small relief column, comprising a handful of armored vehicles and a company of fresh troops, was hastily assembled, their mission to fight their way through the Mujahideen lines and reach the beleaguered garrison on Hill 32-34. The stakes were impossibly high, the outcome hanging precariously in the balance, as the relief column, its vehicles rattling and groaning under the weight of their precious cargo, set off into the unknown, the darkness swallowing them whole. The Mujahideen, sensing victory within their grasp, redoubled their efforts, unleashing a maelstrom of fire that threatened to consume the relief column, their bullets and rockets tearing through the night air, as the Soviet troops, their hearts heavy with foreboding, fought on, driven by a desperate hope that help would arrive before it was too late. And then, in the distance, a glimmer of light, the relief column, its vehicles battered and scarred, but still intact, emerging from the darkness, their headlights casting an eerie glow over the battlefield, as the Soviet troops, their voices hoarse from shouting, their eyes sunken with exhaustion, summoned the last vestiges of their strength to cheer, their spirits buoyed by the knowledge that help had finally arrived. The Mujahideen, their momentum broken, began to falter, their attacks growing less frequent, less intense, as the Soviet troops, their resolve renewed, their determination to hold Hill 32-34 burning brighter than ever, prepared to face another day, another battle, in the war-torn hills of Afghanistan. As the sun rises over Hill 32-34, casting its golden light upon the battered Soviet troops, we are reminded that the true cost of this battle, like so many others in the Soviet-Afghan war, was paid in blood, in sweat, and in tears. The siege, though ultimately repelled, had taken a devastating toll on both sides, the echoes of its fury still resonating through the hills and valleys of Afghanistan. But it is in the face of such unrelenting adversity that we find the true measure of courage, of sacrifice, and of the unyielding human spirit. For in the end, it was not the might of the Soviet war machine, nor the ferocity of the Mujahideen, that decided the fate of Hill 32-34, but the unwavering resolve of the individual soldiers, who, in the face of overwhelming odds, stood firm, their hearts unbroken, their will unshaken. And so, as we reflect upon this forgotten siege, we are compelled to ask ourselves, what is the true cost of war, and what is the true value of the freedoms we so often take for granted? The battle for Hill 32-34 may be all but forgotten, but the lessons it imparted, the sacrifices it